Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12B live lesson for today. So what I wanted to do was start off Unit 3, which is the decline of the Victorian era. So for the last few lessons, you've been learning about the Victorian age and what sort of writing took place throughout it. So now we're going to look at the types of writings that became popular towards the end of that era. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to get started on slide 5. Let me move myself out of the way. Alrighty. Slide 5 starts off with England at the turn of the 20th century. Now, just as a reminder of things that I've said before, when you want to know what year a century is, you take the number they give you, in this case it's 20, and you would subtract 1, that would give us 19, and then add double zeros. So we've got the 1900s. So this is England right when it's turning 1900. Now they give you the major points here on slide 5, which is that the Victorian era included a lot of global expansion. There was military success. Everybody kind of felt hopeful, even if there was some stuff underneath for the lower class that wasn't really great. Overall, the country of Britain felt like they were making a lot of progress. But then, as time does, things started to decline. The British had a lot of colonies that were giving them trouble at the end of the 1800s. They tried to expand some of their control over land, especially overseas. But they basically were wasting money and energy trying to fight these wars against native populations to have control over the land and in various places. And because that stuff drains resources like money and materials, they weren't doing too well when they weren't doing well with their fighting. So one of the examples that they give you here that's notable is the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, in which the Dutch Afrikaners and the British fought for control of South Africa. Now, a lot of people forget that the Dutch did have a lot of control over South Africa, and you can still find people who are descended from Dutch lineages there, even though a lot of people from South Africa are also descended from the British. Remember that it wasn't just one country in Europe that settled Africa and carved it up. It was several of them in agreement with each other. So fighting over the land and who owned what is just a product of them breaking up Africa into the territories that they had. South Africa wasn't the only place where the British had issues. A lot of the colonists, even just outside of native populations, began to argue, after looking at the United States and other islands in the Caribbean, just kind of realized that, well, what's happening is these larger countries are exploiting us for resources. We're doing all the work, doing the settling, converting people to work. At some point, bringing slaves over and things like that to do work. But now what's happening is that all the natural resources are going back to the big parent countries, and we're not benefiting from all of the work that we're doing. So they obviously Britain felt like the resources they were getting were just the cost. Like, well, we have to fund you guys to get you on ships, to get you over there, to get stuff built up. So we're just, asking for taxes back to get returns on our investment. And the colonists felt like you're asking for too much, or asking for too much in proportion to what we're doing and what we need to survive. So a lot of the British versus the colonists in different countries were going back and forth on this for a long time. And some of it held up resources from being sent back. Like it didn't quite escalate to the same degree as like the American Revolution, but there were definitely protests about that kind of thing. And then on slide 6, we get into other issues that sort of led to a less than optimistic outset. There was a lot of religious doubt going on. Charles Darwin was born during this age. He's the one who proposed the theory of evolution. So he definitely challenged religious doctrine at the time. And even people who didn't believe in Charles Darwin's theories, because he wasn't necessarily popular, only a small number of people actually thought that maybe he was right. But there was enough evidence from him on his side for him to feel, or for the population to feel like there was some reason to doubt religious rules, myths, and theories. So there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily atheists. No one was extreme enough to say like there wasn't any God at all. But there were people who became agnostic, meaning that they just admit that they don't know. So maybe the Bible's not real. Maybe the story of Jesus isn't real, but I don't know what is basically what happened. Or maybe it is real and it works together with these theories, but we don't know how. There was just a lot of people who were just unsure at the time, and people were arguing about whether or not you can prove that God exists at all. Now, here on slide 7, we talk about the kings who came into rule after Queen Victoria. So first there was Queen Victoria's son, Edward. He only reigned for 9 years, from 1901 to 1910. And that age is called the Edwardian age. Like if you watch any old age shows where people are in like fancy dresses and stuff, like so there are a few different types of ages that have those kinds of clothings, but usually the Victorian era and the Edwardian era are so close together that they end up getting mixed up for one another. But what's important is that basically the Edwardian era, there was less money to go around. So there was still an emphasis on elegance, but done in a simple, minimalistic way. So people weren't flexing as hard because they didn't have as much money. So they had to make stuff look good and look rich and look affluent, but without spending the amount of money. So you would have like the fancy design language, but using less valuable resources, or you would have fancier clothes that were done in a way that was just less loud and gaudy. So Edwardian is the term that you use to describe restrained. That means you have to pull back, elegance in art, fashion, and stuff like that. And King George came after the Edwardian period, and they're largely grouped together. But just to blow through the Edwardian age really quick, the Edwardian age overlapped with the Victorian era for a little while. Basically, a lot of Victorian ideas kept going on during the Edwardian era, because it takes a long time for people to actually like pivot and change their ideas. So mostly the ideas that were popular during the Edwardian age were kind of like inherited from the Victorian age. So they still felt like classism was important. They still looked down on the lower classes, and they felt like people who earn different amounts of money should be on the top and the bottom. So they shared all of those things in common, and the lower classes were seen as inferior. And the having a hard time moving from one class to another is also present in the Edwardian age as well. And there were some inventions too that they cover out here on slide 7. People were like conservative in terms of money, economics, and people moving up and down on the social pole, but there were some new inventions like electricity. And that really jump-started change, because once technology starts moving, people start living differently to accommodate the convenience of the technology, and that's when things really start changing. So there was the telephone, which made corresponding with people, getting news back and forth easier. And there were automobiles. So not quite cars yet, but things that were like, or not modern cars the way we would know them, but things that were close. And they've got pictures over here of what automobiles looked like at the time, at least like the primitive ones before they started being made closer to what we have today with the motors and stuff. So because of these technologies, people were able to talk to each other more and travel and see the world and see what was happening. And people started fighting for their rights because they saw what other people could get in other places, or they saw injustices in some places that they thought weren't right. So this is when women in Britain lobbied for the right to vote. This is when labor parties started coming up and started basically saying, listen, what we can't do is just have like the children and the poor working for 18 hours a day in a factory. That's not a thing that we can do. People are dying. You want more workers, but you don't want to take care of your workers. We're going to have to do something about this. So this is when that stuff kind of started. And usually, as with normally with technology, things change pretty quickly. There were a lot of people who were against the Victorian age politics and attitudes about working, about education and who should get it and who shouldn't, and also about religion as well. So following after this, King George reigned in 1910 and basically had to deal with all of this because it was up and coming during the Edwardian age. So by the time he was in power, basically people were moving away from the Victorian way of life. And King George spent a lot of time basically trying to reassure his citizens that things were going to work out well, and that there would be some sort of peace in society. He attempted to do that. And there was some stability, but it didn't last very long. There was civil war in Ireland in 1912. And then World War I began not long after that, 2 years later. So this is just a period of a lot of change. And if you've noticed, we're moving from 1800s to the 1900s. So you can kind of get an idea of how quickly things have changed since the Victorian era of what we just went over and studied, because the 1900s sound, a little bit closer to where we are now. We're in 2021. But the 1900s is just 100 and some odd years basically away from where we are now. So things from the Victorian age to now changed very, very quickly. Like this is what cars looked like only a little over, 100 years ago, So that's a lot of change happening in just a century. All right. So then we're going to get into some of the readings. This was basically the background of the times that these people were born, so you can get an idea of what their influences might be like in terms of background. So this is A.E. Houseman. His A.E. stands for Alfred Edward. He was born in Worcestershire, England. That's how you pronounce that. A lot of people jokingly say Worcestershire. It's Worcestershire. And he was the oldest of 7 children. They give you basically his biography, his biography here. But he studied classical literature at Oxford, which is like a very prestigious school. It's good even to today. People talk very highly about it. And he was a very critical person. So he studied classic writing, and he began to write scholarly journals. And basically, he had really good quality writing because he studied so hard. And he ended up getting a job as a professor at a college in London. And a lot of people feel like his critical personality is very cold and distant. And you can get some of that, you can read through some of that from his writing. He wrote poetry. And here on slide 12, they give you a rundown of everything that he did. I'm going to hit the major points. His first collection of poems was called A Shropshire Lad. which was published in 1896. And there was basically a story to this collection of poems. So this is written, it was a collection of poems written as if they were narrated by a homesick farm boy who was living in the city. So that was the idea. He sold his own poetry as like, well, here's a homesick farm boy living in the city writing about his homeland. And perhaps he did feel like that, but he presented them like it was a character. He got turned down to publish this work a lot, and he self-published it, and it became very, very, very successful. He also released a second collection of poems, which was Last Poems. He did this like 2 decades later, 25 years later, and it was also successful. And after he died, his brother published the rest of his works that were not already published in more poetry and additional poems. Now it says here, Housman's poems reflect the grim outlook of the late Victorian era. Recurring themes include death with no religious consolation, the fleeting nature of love, and the decay of youth. But he's known for simple everyday language and traditional use of rhyme. So that means lines that rhyme in a pattern. That's usually what's considered traditional rhyme. And the simple everyday language, as well as the grim outlook, is what makes up the Victorian influence. People were not happy at the end of the Victorian era. But there was traditional stuff that was popular during the Victorian age. So he basically took some of the ways of writing that were popular during the Victorian era and used it in his work, but put the viewpoint, like the point of view, the POV, the perspective of what people felt at his time into his poetry. So there was a little bit of combining the old style with the new feelings that people had. Okay. Now, just as a reminder, as you know, I usually don't go over excerpts. If you want help with understanding the meaning of an excerpt, please contact a tutor and schedule a session. But I am going to go over a little bit of the analysis that's here, just to make sure that you have a good idea of what you're going to encounter in the poem. Sometimes it helps if you know what you're about to encounter, so you'll have an easier time working through the words and associating it with the explanation, because you already know what it should be associated with. Now, the poem that they give you by Housman is To an Athlete Dying Young. So the long story short of this poem is that the narrator of the poem, the person telling the story, is commenting on a funeral procession for an athlete that died at a young age. It opens in a way that's ironic. So the poem is about a champion athlete who died at a young age, but the opening of the poem talks about the athlete after winning a game when he's being celebrated. He's carried on the shoulders of fans, the kind of stuff that you normally see when people win. You know, people lift you up, hoist you over their shoulder. You're like, yeah, yeah. So he starts off with a description of that. But in the second stanza, or like paragraph, that's the equivalent of paragraphs for poetry, he gives you the same words and phrasing in the description, but instead of describing a celebration, he's describing the athlete being carried on the shoulders of his peers in a coffin. And instead of those being adoring fans or the rest of his team, they are pallbearers. So he's painting the picture of those two things being similar. You're carried on the shoulders of your loved ones and friends, both when you are at the height of your success and also when you are dead. So he's linking those two images together so you can see that there's something in common with those. Now, the reason why he does this is because the person telling this story in the poem has the idea that the athlete was lucky to die at the height of his glory after he was famous and won a bunch of games. Because then if you die while people are celebrating you, you don't have to watch them forget about all the great stuff you did. And that's pretty much the idea of this poem. Now, all of this together, everything that I just said, is supposed to be an allegory or a symbol that represents the end of the Victorian period. The author's basically saying that because they didn't die, the British are watching the height of their success in the Victorian age crumble and fade, and people are forgetting about how great Britain used to be now that we're moving out of the Victorian age. So there's a couple of different kinds of comparisons that are being made there. He's making the point that it's better to die while people are celebrating you instead of after you're old and people have forgotten and don't care or don't respect you for what you've done. But then he's also linking those things that are relatable to people in life to the British Empire and how it's viewed during his time. Now here on slide 15, they just give you some quotes from the poem that show you about the ideas that I just explained. So take some time to read these if you can. I always think it's best for some students to read the analysis before they go back and read the actual poem. I think that if you read the excerpts and the explanations, they help you understand and make those connections so that your eyes just aren't glossing across the page and you don't know what's going on. So Hausman uses symbols throughout the poem. So like we talked about some of the symbolism behind the athlete being carried and how that relates to Britain. But he uses a lot of symbols in this poem just in general. And basically, there's just a lot of images that overlap. He talks about glory. He talks about the cheers. There's some natural elements in here too. So for example, they give you an early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose. So this is a laurel and this is a rose, and they're using these as symbols. So the laurel is basically, as a small, background explanation, it's what champions were given in Greece. If you were a winner or someone important, if you were the emperor of Rome, if you were a high statesman, you could wear a laurel. It's for someone who is successful and who has done great things. But it says, and early though the laurel grows, meaning you can be successful in your youth early on, it withers quicker than the rose. So he's making the point that as you get older, your glory does not stay. They highlight that here. You can achieve great things when you're young, but people don't remember those years later, is what he's saying. So these are just the symbols that he's using during the poem to sort of like hammer in the idea that like it's better to die young because then at least people are still celebrating you. Whether or not you agree with that idea is completely different, but this is what this author thought and what he wrote to in his poem. So because he thinks that this is a good thing, that this guy died young, this poem is written in a way that seems positive because he thinks this is a good thing. He thinks that you should live life to the fullest before you get old and nobody cares about the things you've done. For some people, that is a good message. For other people, not so much. It makes it seem like when you're older, just because people aren't acknowledging you, there aren't good things happening in your life. That's not always how it goes. And you also have to think about how life was at this time. What the lifespan was for people was shorter than it is now. We're also talking about someone who is from not nobility, but a higher class. He had a good education. He had support. Perhaps for someone in the lower class, they wouldn't be able to identify with this poem because you spend your younger years just working hard and slaving away to help make money for your family. So there's no room for glory or doing great things and stuff like that. There are lots of different perspectives that people could have on this poem. I'm just letting you know that you don't have to agree with what's in the poem. This is just what he thought at the time, and it represents how Britons felt about the glory of Britain fading away. Now, here on slide 16, they talk about some of the not just the pictures and imagery that he used, but the actual format of the poem. So he uses rhyme and regular rhythm. So like the lines in this poem are all similar sizes. They have similar amounts of syllables in them. That's the number of sounds per word. And the reason why he does this is because having the lines be the same creates a rhythm when you read it. They give you an excerpt here. Now you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out, runners who renown outran and the name died before a man. None of these lines are really longer than the other, so it doesn't take longer to read those. And because there are rhymes, we have route and out, we have outran and man, it helps you keep rhythm naturally in your head while you're reading. The reason why he did this is because the rhythm being regular and predictable in the poem is supposed to help you think of keeping time, like in a beat. And that is supposed to represent time. So we know that when we have a beat and a pattern, it's called time. There's like 3/4 time, there's 2/2 time, there's 4/4 time, right? In terms of speed. So when we think of time, we think of the span of life that everyone has, because that is time. And that's the topic of the poem. He's talking about how long people have to do things in their life. So he made the format of the poem in a format that will remind people of time, since the poem is literally about time and how people spend it and how they will be remembered. It also makes the poem kind of song-like. When you have rhymes like that, people think of music, which again, thinking of music is another way of thinking of rhythm, thinking of time. So that cycles back into each other. And then they give you some information about how this poem sounds. Obviously, this person is older. He's commenting on the death of a younger person. And he's watched the glory, quote unquote, of his own youth fade. Maybe people don't remember what he used to do anymore. So he's thinking, man, that kid that died, I wish I could have did that. Which obviously, doesn't sound great at all, but he's making the point that it is better to die young when people can remember you for the best things that you've done right when you've done them, instead of being old and people having to struggle with knowing or remembering. If you're older, there's going to be some people who have met you that don't know about any of the great things you did. So when you die and they reflect on you and your memory, they're not there to reference that. He is the sort of person that prefers to be recognized, the guy in this poem. So he's commenting on how he wishes he could be like that young man, because I guess some of his accomplishments have been forgotten and he wishes that they weren't. Now, we talked about Houseman using simple language, and this excerpt is also an example of that. Now, you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out. Swell means to like fill or build up. Route is like a path. So we've got runners whom renown outran and the name died before the man. So basically what he's saying is you're not going to build someone up when their accomplishments are old. And the runners who renown means to be famous, outran, and the name died before the man. So he's using the runners as an example. He's saying that there are famous runners who broke records, but their records and their memory died before they did. And he's pointing out that people don't talk up past legends who are not relevant. Basically, if you're not relevant, it's not worth it, is what he's saying. He's literally clout chasing is what's happening here. And he's complaining that people don't talk about others who have achieved a lot after a while and just saying it's not fair. That's pretty much what's happening. But he uses pretty simple language to do this. So this seems complicated maybe to you or me because this is a little further back in history for English and how it's written. But these lines are pretty simple. There's no like complicated descriptions of like people running, the sweat on their faces, what the day is like, what the ground was like when they were running. There's none of that. It's a simple sentence. Runners whom renown outran, and the name died before the man. Famous people who broke records and outran other famous runners who had their reputations left behind before they died. That is a simple concept that most people can understand, you know, like once you translate it from this version of English. So Houseman was known for simple language and it was straightforward. So the straightforward language he used combined with his rhythm makes this song like, it makes it almost seem like it's a happier poem than what it's about, which is literally about death and the death of an athlete. And what they're saying here at the bottom of this paragraph is that this is something that's typical of Houseman's work. So he uses simple words and he uses simple rhymes like this on purpose to make his poems seem more lighthearted than they actually are. Alrighty. Now we're on to Thomas Hardy, which is our second reading selection for today. I believe we have one more after this. So we get some information about him. He was born in Dorset, England. He was known for his stoic pessimism. So he's not that far removed from Houseman, to be honest. Stoic means not really showing emotion, and pessimism means not really believing in the good in the world. He had an education that was based on Latin poets. So that's older classical poets and French romances. He studied architecture, took French classes. He went to the theater and read a lot of Charles Darwin. So that's the guy who pioneered the evolution theory. So that kind of stuff influenced his writing. You're getting some of his background here so you can get an idea. Maybe he's a little, you know, maybe he acknowledges the beauty in the arts, but as a thinker, he's a little more critical and scientific. So they give you some information about his career. He started writing poetry in 1865, and he stopped being an architect to do that. But his work was not well received at first, which stressed him out. He basically went back to his hometown after living abroad to try to recover from the devastation of his work not being received well. He tried to write novels, which are like full stories, and he tried to challenge traditional Victorian beliefs, which makes sense. So if he follows Charles Darwin and he believes in evolution, and he was influenced by other modern thinkers at the time, that means that he was very against the traditional and older Victorian values. And it says here, his book caused so much public controversy, his novels, that he actually went back to writing poetry, even though it wasn't well received in the beginning anyway. So then they tell you here, Hardy accomplished and published a variety of poetic work, including several lyrics. So that's like songs, dramatic monologues. That's almost like speeches that you perform, and even an epic drama. And then it says his poetry, start again right here. His poetry captures the breakdown of traditional Victorian culture, emerging pessimism, and growing religious skepticism. So he basically went from trying to write novels that just directly said, this is wrong and it shouldn't be that way, to writing poetry that was more like on pace to where the public was in thought. So instead of just straight up saying this is wrong, he wrote more about, well, here's why people are changing their views. So, you know, he kind of softened it up a little bit. And then it says his writing style is notable and his style verges on modernism. So just as a reminder, this is from 12A, really. Modernism is kind of using everyday informal speech, breaking up rhythms, normal rhythms for poems, and not having rhyme that was consistent, just as a reminder. During the modernism age, people were trying really hard to get away from anything that could be considered classical, and they experimented a lot with like different styles of sort of breaking traditional formats. So his style, being closer to modernism than anything Victorian, is important because it would have been very, very difficult, and I'm sorry, not difficult, very, very different from what anyone else was writing at the time. And here, just, to highlight for your notes, colloquial speech, awkward syntax, and inconsistent rhymes. So he definitely broke the mold. Now, the poem they're going to have you read from him is called The Darkling Thrush. And as always, I'm not going to read the excerpt, but we'll go over the analysis together. So the darkling thrush, a thrush is a type of bird. And darkling is just a descriptor. So darkling thrush means this is a dark colored thrush, more than likely. So this poem is important because it was written in 1900, literally the year 1900. And this poem is a reflection of that. It's supposed to be a reflection on the 19th century ending and the 20th century starting, since it was written literally on the year 1900. So there's a lot of dark language in this. They give you an excerpt here. It says there's ominous imagery and figurative language. So ominous just means like foreboding, eerie. It's a bad sign. And figurative language means that there's a lot of descriptors that are supposed to represent things. There's metaphors and things like that. So he basically writes about winter, and writes about winter as if winter is a person. And he compares winter to a consumed beverage. So like something you drink that has been emptied. So all that's left are like the undesirable particles at the bottom of the glass. So think pulp from orange juice, or leaves, or small leaves from tea. Or just anything that you will leave in the bottom of the glass, the stuff you rinse down the sink. And he goes on to say that the sediment, that's particles, that's a fancy word for particles. Sediment is like particles of rock. So he's using it here to describe what's at the bottom of the cup. And he says the things that are left over from winter block out the setting sun. And then he goes on to describe the sun as a weakened eye. So this is a lot of like negative images that are happening at once. We've got an empty cup that's been drank. We've got the undesirable bits at the bottom of the cup. And then those bits are blocking out the sun, which is normally a great, like a happy sign when the sun is up. And then he describes the sun as a weakened eye. So he's saying even the sun is weak. There's not as much happiness or brightness coming from it. So this is supposed to represent the low hopes and disappointment and frustration that people had as they watched the Victorian era pass into something different and undesirable. They wanted their glory back. They want their country to be doing well again so that they can also be doing well. But that's not what's happening. So on top of all that, he's basically comparing the Victorian era to a bright, sunny summer and this new age that they're moving into as a winter. So on slide 21, they go into a little more detail about imagery examples. So if you remember, imagery is when you use descriptive words to paint a picture that someone can actually see in their head of what you're describing. So we have the tangled vine stems score at the sky like strings of broken lyres. So let's break this down. I'm going to start at the end and then move back. So a lyre is a small handheld instrument. It's a string instrument that you pluck. So like think of the U-shaped string instrument that like sometimes angels or like Greek gods have in their hand where they're holding in their string, you know, pulling on the strings. That's what a lyre is. So just so that you can start off knowing what that is, that'll help. Now, first of all, it says broken lyre. So we're already in uh like sad territory. But then it says the tangled bind stems scored the sky. So they're talking about plant stems, and that's why they have this picture here. They're trying to give you this picture so you can picture the lyre and these strings that are broken. So this isn't just a lyre whose like strings are cut, they're all tangled and stuff as well. So since they mentioned that it's tangled, it's just this instrument is unplayable. And they're saying score at the sky, that means like decorating the sky. They're literally, I'm sorry, littering the sky. So that's all you can see. Imagine this photo right here being the only thing you can see in your vision. So they're making the comparison of the stems, the plant stems to the strings to give you an idea that things are just not right. A lyre is supposed to have straight strings. You're supposed to be able to play it. When you play a lyre, you're playing music, you're making song, and that is supposed to make people happy. So if the instrument is broken and the plant stems are supposed to remind you of broken lyres, they're just, what he's trying to tell you is that even the stuff that's in nature seems like it's out of place and there's something wrong with it. So this is his commentary on what England is going through, or Britain is going through at the time. It's not great. Something's not right. There's something in the air. It's off. It's not cool. So he's trying to help you picture his feeling of things being off and not being well, and Britain not being in a good place. So here on slide 22, they just sort of go over the fact that his poem is pessimistic in tone. So again, we're talking him being just kind of negative about where things are headed. And they give you some connection to the title here in this slide. So this is a thrush. This is a picture of a thrush here on the left side. And they give you some descriptions that kind of show you some of the negativity. So the thrush in the poem at some point is described as frail, gaunt, and small. And they give you a little peek, even though this poem is so negative. There's like a little bit of optimism in there, just a little hope. There is a line where it says that the darkling thrush chooses to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So if you're supposed to represent something good, and this a thrush is a bird, and birds can sing. So by putting a living thing that can sing in this poem, especially after comparing the plants to a broken lyre, by putting something living in this poem that can produce song, the thrush is supposed to represent something good. And if the thrush is flinging its soul, that means like to throw its soul on the growing gloom. So like if you're a good thing and you're throwing itself into what seems like an uncertain future, maybe you're hoping that that small bit of goodness can change something. So that's the metaphor in the poem. But the poem is mostly negative. Like, man, I hope things get better, but I don't know. That's basically the mood of this entire poem. And they talk about that sort of simple rhythm and rhyme scheme, giving the poem a song-like quality, just like Hausmann's poem. And basically, this poem is supposed to be representing the doubt that he has. So maybe things are completely unsalvageable. Things might get better, but press X to doubt. That's basically what this poem is encompassing, but in like a more elegant and beautiful way. And then they conclude here with like writers such as Hardy and Houseman stood at the threshold of modernism. So they both were very close to the modernistic style that we recognize, even though that didn't happen for decades later. It says we can see the birth of modern poetry in Hardy's experiments with colloquial, that means everyday, informal language, spontaneity in diction. So, when you're spontaneous, you're unpredictable. So there are some words that he uses here that normally aren't used in poetry. So spontaneity in diction and syntax, that means sentence structure, and freedom of form. So those are things that are normally associated with modern poetry. That are present in this poem. So now that you know what you're looking at, go back and read the excerpt and see if you can piece some of these together. I know that I kind of glossed over some of these because I want you to go back and read these examples for yourself. The analysis that they give you here is a really good tool for you to go back and understand the poems that you are about to read. My advice to new students is, if possible, always read the analysis before you can read the excerpt, if possible. If it's not possible, like if there's a lesson activity or something like that, then just go ahead and read the excerpt first, do your best on those assignments, and then read the analysis, go back and read the excerpt, because it'll help you understand so that you don't have to ask questions when you get to the mastery test. All righty. So our last excerpt for today is going to be from Rudyard Kipling. So Rudyard Kipling was born in Bombay, India, and his father was an artist and a teacher. Basically, he was in a good class. He had money and support, and he was exposed to a lot of artists, a lot of scholars, so people who studied. He only spent 6 years in India before going to school in England. Because of that, he had a little experience with life in India, and then also a lot of experience with life in England. And he went back to India in his adulthood to work as a journalist. And he published a lot of poems, short stories, and novels. He is one of the most popular writers of the Victorian era. And he's famous not just for some of his works, but he's also known for being offered a lot of different awards and refusing all of them except the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. So he got offered tons of stuff and he was like, no, I don't want that recognition. No, I don't want that. But the Nobel Peace Prize, though, I'll take that. He was first recognized for his poetry, and then he became known for short stories. A lot of his work is about the British Empire and how they colonized different places. Basically, he's known for writing about a lot of different countries that were colonized by Britain and creating realistic portrayals of characters from there. He made the types of characters that you would remember. Now, if you're taking this class being in the 12th grade, at least in terms of credits, the thing that you probably know him for is the Jungle Book. This is the guy that wrote the Jungle Book. Yes, the same one that was adapted into like 2 or 3 live action films. The same one that is a pretty decently famous Disney film. He wrote that. He wrote that children's book. And most of his famous books are children's books, but he is known for some other things. They give you a few titles from other things that he's written here. We've got Plain Tales from the Hills. We have Soldiers 3 and Barrack Room Ballads. Those are his more adult works that are popular. But write that down. I will write that down just for the mastery test in case they ask you about some of his other works. But the Jungle Book is what he's most known for. Now, they give you a little more information about him here. He was a part of a small group of writers that specifically found inspiration in non-traditional sources, which is the British Empire colonies. They basically tried to focus on giving people interesting descriptions of what those lands were like that were colonized to make their stories interesting. And they also wrote about the complicated relationship that people have with colonialism. Now, remember at the beginning of the lesson, we talked about how that was a complicated thing for many reasons, especially because of the position that the colonists were put in terms of the empire, but also there's the relationship that the colonists have to have with the people who live in an area that they colonize. Now, this is a thing that we talk a lot about today. You can open up TikTok or YouTube and find a lot of videos on how colonists treated people during that time. But they were living in those areas at that time and basically wrote about them even back then, even in like the beginning of the 1900s. And this is where we get to like the sort of controversial part of Kipling's writing. So Kipling's writing is good. No one really disputes his skill for writing. You can read what a lot of his different works and tell that there's skill there. But he supported colonialism. He was definitely a fan of the idea that it was the duty of white men from European countries to tame native populations. And he believed that even though he was a native from India. So a lot of his writing reflects that, not everything, but a lot of things. At best, he just doesn't comment on it at all. Like, think of the Jungle Book. There were Europeans settling the jungle at that time. And even though it was a part of the story, it wasn't portrayed as anything wrong or bad. It just was something that was happening. And at worst, he actually supports the idea and basically makes it clear that he thinks those countries are better off because they were colonized. But the importance of reading his stories and at looking at his type of writing is because it gives you an important look at how people felt at the time. No matter how you feel about colonialism or what Britain did to other countries, the thing is, this gives us an idea of how people actually felt at that time. And it's important to have a realistic view of the past and what it was so that we can learn from it and also just have a very realistic view of things were like at that time. It's very easy to look back in the past in a time that you didn't live and sort of just imagine that things were better because of how things are now and things that you might be dissatisfied with. But the fact of the matter is, no matter what age you're in, there's always flaws, there's always difficult ideas and realities that people have to work with and work through. And in some cases, people are just wrong. At a certain point, people thought the earth was flat. That's realistically what people thought. Like, people would actually go through their entire life thinking that the earth was flat, coming up with theories about how traveling works based on that theory until it was, disproven and stuff like that. So it's just important to keep in mind how far we've come in terms of not just history, but also writing. So we've definitely gone from people from colonized countries writing about how it makes sense for them to be colonized to people looking back at history and realizing, yeah, this is what they thought at the time, but that was really wrong. It's just important to keep a realistic view about how those things are. Okay, so on slide 27, again, we get a small summary of Kim, which is the work that we're going to read an excerpt from by Kipling. Kim was published in 1901 and it takes place in India. So they tell you it's an adventure story about a young boy named Kimball O'Hara. So Kim is his nickname. And the story is about his adventures on the Grand Trunk Road. So that's a traveling route in India for trade. And basically, Kim is an orphan, but he's obviously from European heritage based on his looks. His skin is tanned from the weather, which is like very hot and unforgiving in many parts of India. The fact that he has tan skin gives him, to some people, the appearance of an Indian. So basically what they're telling you is his skin is probably like olive colored, someone from maybe like the southern part of Europe. He's got enough features for people to not be sure if he's fully Indian or partially European or anything like that. And he's known as the little friend of all the world. And he lives basically culturally as an Indian. So he's supposed to represent the blending between the East and West that was very prominent in India at the time. So on slide 28, they go on to give you a little more information about the story and how it unfolds. So Kim is a children's book. So that gives you an idea of how it's going to sound when you read it. Things are pretty simple. There's not a whole lot of super complex explanations or descriptions in there. But even though it's a children's book, it still goes into the idea of dealing with themes of identity and the effects of colonialism. So Kim basically is caught in the middle of things. Things are complicated for him. So earlier on what I'll say is in the beginning of the story, you get this excerpt, they give it to you right here. But basically, it's a detail of Kim playing with one of his friends. And it's basically like a king of the mountain sort of game, who can stay at the top. So he kicks his native friend off of the cannon because British people who are like Kim have control over the Punjab. That is the group of people in the region that they were in. And it's supposed to represent the effects of colonialism, like in a small bite-sized kind of way. He's living in their country. He's an orphan, but because he's European, he considers himself better than the natives. Now, this story goes into detail about how difficult it is for him, because even though he feels that way, he only feels that way because he knows he's British. He's technically British, even though he was born there. But he looks enough to pass as a native. So people treat him however they perceive him. So if they categorize him as an Indian, they treat him like that. If they categorize him as a European because they recognize some of his features, then they treat him like that. And he has a lot of issues on the inside, just because he holds himself over other Indian people, but he still has a weird relationship with the British people who live in India because, one, he's an orphan, and two, because he lives culturally like an Indian, he still has internalized some of the disdain and fear that and mistrust that the Indians have for the colonizers. So he gets to paint the picture for you, the reader, on both sides. You get to see the parts of him that are awful and the parts of him that are awful because he's British and he feels superior, and the parts of him that experience the same things that some Indians do. Now, obviously, this is, I mean, like, just saying it in plain terms, this is awful. This is whack. Him being British should not make him better or help him feel better than any of the other children who are growing up in this area. But it's a realistic view of how British people and Indians thought of each other at the time. It's a little easy to forget, but Rudyard Kipling, in spite of his name, is actually Indian. He was born in India and he did live there as a child before getting his education in England. So this is as close to an accurate representation, maybe skewed a little bit by Kipling's views because we know he was pro-colonialism, as we can get. So you have to take all this information while you're reading and try to pick out what he's saying and what his point of view is and what the story is trying to tell you. These are just stories. No one's trying to show you what's right or wrong in terms of how to feel about this or the issues that are related to it. But it is important to think about how you personally feel about these things while you're reading the story. Oh, yep. Alrighty. That's it for this lesson. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. All right. Yeah. So this was a longer lesson covering the end of the Victorian era. And we'll be moving on into more modern writing, some science fiction, a little bit, more fun stuff. We've had like 4 lessons on the Victorian era. So I know you guys are tired of it, but we're at the end. So uh, if you have any issues understanding this lesson or the excerpts, please contact a tutor or contact your teacher or mentor to get in touch with a tutor. And I think that's about it. Just go back and take notes. I know there was a lot of historical information about the times, how they were changing, the Edwardian age, the Georgian age, but you can keep track of it. Just make sure you have it in your notes so you can answer any questions if they come up on the mastery test. But all right, this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.